The Valeri Empire had once ruled over countless worlds, its shimmering cities stretching across the stars like jewels in the darkness. For thousands of years, they had been powerful, their technology far beyond the reach of most species. But power never lasted forever. War had come. The Jarek warlords, brutal conquerors from the far edge of the galaxy, had attacked the Valeri without mercy. World after world had fallen. Their fleets, once unmatched, were now burning in space. Their warriors, proud and noble, were scattered or dead. Now, their last hope lay in the hands of a child. Princess Lyrian Valeri, the last heir of the Empire, stood inside a dimly lit chamber of a hidden space station. Her small frame was wrapped in a flowing silver robe, her violet eyes wide with fear. She was only 8 cycles old, a child by her people's standards. But she understood enough. Her world was dying. Across the chamber, Captain Vadris, a grizzled old warrior, knelt before her. His once shining armor was scratched and broken, his face lined with exhaustion. "Princess," he said, his voice rough but gentle, "we cannot hold them back any longer. The enemy is coming." Lyrian swallowed hard. She had grown up hearing stories of heroes, Valeri warriors who stood against impossible odds, but she was not a warrior. She was just a child. What must I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Vadris placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "You must survive." Behind him, an escape pod hummed to life. Its sleek, silver hull was designed for stealth, built to carry one passenger far from danger. Its destination was unknown, chosen at random to prevent the enemy from tracking her. "Where will it take me?" Lyrian whispered. Vadris hesitated. "To a planet on the far edge of the galaxy. A place called Earth." Lyrian had never heard of it. Her tutors had spoken of great civilizations, mighty star empires, ancient knowledge, and powerful warriors. Earth was not among them. "Is it safe?" Vadris hesitated again. "It is unknown. The humans are a young species, untested in the greater wars of the galaxy. But they are survivors. That may be what we need most." A sudden explosion rocked the station. The walls trembled. Distant alarms howled as the Jarek fleet arrived. Vadris stood sharply. "There is no time." He guided Lyrian to the escape pod and pressed a small silver pendant into her palm. "This is your birthright. Keep it safe. One day, you will return to rebuild what was lost." Tears welled in Lyrian's eyes. "But what about you?" Vadris smiled, though sorrow lay behind his eyes. "I will hold them back for as long as I can." Lyrian knew what that meant. The Jarek never took prisoners. She wanted to stay. She wanted to fight. But she was just a child, and her people needed her to live. With a final nod, she stepped into the escape pod. The doors sealed shut with a hiss, and the pod shuddered as it launched into the black void of space. As she drifted away, she saw the station burning, the last warriors of the Valeri making their final stand. And then, nothing. Only the silence of space. She curled up inside the pod, clutching the silver pendant to her chest. She was alone now, and she was falling toward an unknown world. The night sky over the Alaskan wilderness was clear and cold. The stars twinkled like tiny diamonds, and the vast forest stretched endlessly in every direction. Jack Carter sat on the porch of his small wooden cabin, staring at the sky. The quiet of the wilderness had become his home, his refuge. Jack was a man who had seen too much war. He had served as a soldier in conflicts that no longer mattered. When he returned home, he found the world too loud, too fast. So he left it behind and chose this life, alone, away from the noise. But tonight, something unusual happened. A streak of fire blazed across the sky, cutting through the darkness. At first, Jack thought it was a meteor. But as it got closer, he realized it was too controlled, too precise. Whatever it wasn't just falling, it was crashing. A deep boom echoed through the forest as the object disappeared behind the trees. The ground trembled slightly beneath his feet, Jack narrowed his eyes. That was no ordinary crash. Curiosity mixed with instinct. Years of military training told him to investigate. He grabbed his jacket, his flashlight, and his old rifle, just in case. The journey into the woods was rough. The trees stood tall and silent, their bare branches swaying in the wind. Jack moved quickly, his boots crunching over the frost-covered leaves. Then he saw it. A silver pod, half buried in the snow, steam rising from its surface. It was smooth, metallic, and shaped like a teardrop. Strange blue lights flickered along its edges, but they were fading, as if the pod had used the last of its power. Jack stepped closer, his grip tightening on his rifle. He didn't believe in aliens, but he had seen enough in his life to know that the world held many secrets. This was something new. Then, movement. The pod's door hissed open slightly. Inside, something small stirred. Jack raised his weapon, heart pounding. Was it dangerous? Was it alive? A soft whimper reached his ears. Not a growl, not a snarl, a child's cry. Frowning, he lowered his rifle and stepped forward. Carefully, he pulled the pod's door open, letting out a gasp at what he saw. A little girl, but not human. She was curled up inside the pod, trembling. Her skin was silver, smooth like polished metal, but soft like flesh. Her violet eyes fluttered open, filled with fear. She wore a strange robe, torn and stained, and a small pendant rested in her tiny hands. She looked weak, exhausted, but most of all, she looked scared. Jack's instincts took over. He didn't see an alien. He saw a child in need. "Hey, kid," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "You okay?" The girl flinched at his voice. She didn't understand him. Jack sighed. He wasn't good with kids, but he had seen enough scared faces in his time to know what to do. Slowly, carefully, he reached out his hand. Not fast, not threatening, just enough to show he wasn't going to hurt her. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, hesitantly, she placed her small, trembling fingers into his rough, calloused palm. Jack felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Responsibility. He exhaled and gave a small nod. "All right, kid. Let's get you out of here." He wrapped his coat around her tiny form and lifted her into his arms. She was light as a feather, her fragile body shivering against the cold. As he carried her back through the trees, he didn't know who she was. He didn't know where she came from or why she had crashed here. But one thing was certain. She wasn't safe out here. And whether he liked it or not, she was now his problem. The warmth of the cabin was a sharp contrast to the freezing Alaskan wilderness outside. The crackling fire cast soft shadows across the wooden walls, filling the space with a comforting glow. Jack Carter carefully set the strange little girl down on his old couch, wrapping her in a thick wool blanket. She was still trembling, her violet eyes wide with fear, but at least she wasn't shivering from the cold anymore. Her silver skin shimmered faintly in the firelight, and her small hands clutched a pendant as if it were the only thing keeping her together. Jack exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an expert on aliens. He was just a man who wanted to be left alone. But now, he had a frightened alien child sitting in his cabin, looking at him like he was either her savior or her captor. "All right, kid," he muttered, crouching in front of her. "Let's start simple. You got a name?" The girl blinked, clearly not understanding his words. Jack sighed. Of course not. That would have been too easy. He pointed at himself. "Jack." Then he pointed at her, raising an eyebrow. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, in a soft, uncertain voice, she whispered, "Lyrian." Her accent was strange, musical, almost like a song. But at least they were getting somewhere. Jack nodded. "Lyrian. Okay." She flinched slightly when he said her name, but she didn't seem afraid. Just wary. watching him, studying him. Jack stood up and grabbed a mug of warm water, bringing it to her. She looked at it suspiciously. "It's just water," he said, taking a sip to show her. "Drink. You look like you need it." Lyrian hesitated, but eventually took the mug with both hands. She sniffed it first, probably making sure it wasn't poison, then took a small sip. Her tense shoulders relaxed slightly. Jack sat back in his chair, watching her. This was insane. A few hours ago, his life was quiet, predictable. Now, he was playing babysitter to an alien princess. "So," he said, more to himself than her, "what the hell am I supposed to do with you?" A fragile trust. The next morning, Jack woke up early, but Lyrian was already awake. She was sitting by the window, staring at the sky with a lost expression. She had draped the blanket around herself like a cloak, her small fingers gripping her pendant tightly. Jack sighed. She was scared, lost, alone. He could see it in the way her tiny shoulders were hunched forward, as if she was trying to make herself disappear. "Hungry?" he asked. Lyrian turned to look at him, but didn't answer. Jack took that as a yes. He walked over to the small kitchen and started cooking eggs and toast. It wasn't much, but it was warm and easy. He wasn't sure if aliens even ate the same food as humans, but Lyrian's stomach had growled softly last night, so he figured she needed something. As the smell of food filled the cabin, Lyrian's nose twitched slightly. Her eyes flickered toward the plate as he set it in front of her. She hesitated. Jack took a bite of his own food, chewing slowly. "See, not poison." Lyrian still looked unsure, but after a few seconds, she picked up a piece of toast and took a small bite. Her eyes widened slightly. Jack smirked. "Yeah, that's called bread. Nothing fancy, but it won't kill you." Lyrian didn't respond, but she continued eating, her movements slow and careful. Jack could tell she was still wary of him, but at least she wasn't terrified anymore. They ate in silence for a while. Jack wasn't the type to talk much anyway, and Lyrian seemed more comfortable that way. After breakfast, he pointed at her torn robe. "You can't walk around in that forever. Let's find you something warmer." Lyrian tilted her head slightly, not understanding. Jack sighed, then walked over to a drawer and pulled out an old hoodie. It was way too big for her, but it would be better than the thin fabric she was wearing. He held it out. "Here, warmer than that thing." Lyrian stared at the hoodie for a moment before finally taking it. She ran her fingers over the fabric, studying it curiously. After a moment, she slipped it over her head. It practically swallowed her tiny frame. The sleeves were too long, and the hood nearly covered her face. Jack chuckled. "Yeah, we'll have to fix that." For the first time since he found her, Lyrian made a small sound, a tiny, quiet giggle. Jack's smirk faded. That sound, it reminded him of something long buried. A time before war. A time when he had people in his life. People he had lost. He looked at Lyrian, this tiny alien child who had landed in his world completely alone. Maybe she wasn't the only one who needed saving. A dangerous secret. That night, as Jack sat by the fire, Lyrian finally spoke again. In a small, hesitant voice, she said, "Jack." Jack raised an eyebrow. It was the first time she had said his name. She pointed at the sky, her expression filled with fear and sadness. "They come," she whispered. Jack's body tensed. "Who?" Lyrian swallowed hard. "Bad ones." Jack's jaw clenched. He didn't know who they were, but if Lyrian was running from something, that meant danger was coming. And if danger was coming, Jack Carter wasn't going to sit back and let it happen. The night was colder than usual, the wind howling through the trees. Jack Carter stood on the porch of his cabin, his sharp eyes scanning the sky. Something didn't feel right. Lyrian's warning echoed in his mind. "They come." She had barely spoken since she arrived, but those two words had been enough to send a chill down Jack's spine. He had seen fear in her violet eyes. Real fear, whatever she was running from. Whoever was chasing her was dangerous. Jack wasn't the type to panic. He had been a soldier, fought in battles most people never even heard about. But this was different. He had no idea what he was up against. Inside the cabin, Lyrian sat curled up in a blanket near the fire, hugging her silver pendant tightly. Jack had spent the day trying to make her comfortable, but she remained distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. Finally, he sat down across from her and spoke. "Tell me about them." Lyrian hesitated, gripping the pendant harder. Her small fingers trembled. "Jarek," she whispered. Jack frowned. He had never heard that name before. "Who are they?" Lyrian's eyes darkened. "Hunters. Destroyers." That was all Jack needed to hear. He had seen the look in her eyes before. He had seen it in war. It was the look of someone who had lost everything. Jack exhaled slowly. "And they're coming for you." Lyrian nodded. Silence filled the room. Jack glanced at his old rifle leaning against the wall. It had served him well in the past. But if these things were powerful enough to wipe out an empire, a single rifle wouldn't do much. Still, Jack Carter wasn't the kind of man to back down. If these Jarek were coming, he'd be ready. The first sign. The next morning, Jack was chopping wood when he heard something. A strange hum in the air. It was distant, barely noticeable, but his instincts kicked in immediately. He turned toward the sky. Far above, something dark moved between the clouds. It was too fast to be an airplane, too quiet to be a helicopter. Jack's grip tightened on the axe handle. They were here. He dropped the axe and rushed inside the cabin. Lyrian. She was already standing, her small body tense, her violet eyes filled with dread. She had felt it too. "We have to go," Jack said. Lyrian clutched her pendant, shaking her head. "Nowhere safe." Jack kneeled in front of her. "Kid, I don't know much about aliens, but I know how to survive. We're not staying here." Lyrian hesitated, but she nodded. Jack grabbed his backpack and stuffed it with supplies. Water, food, a flashlight, and ammo for his rifle. Then he pulled out an old revolver, checking the chamber before tucking it into his belt. He wasn't sure if human weapons would do anything against the Jarek, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He threw on a thick coat and turned to Lyrian. "Put on your hoodie. We're leaving." She obeyed without question, slipping on the oversized hoodie he had given her. It still looked too big on her, but it would keep her warm. Jack opened the door and scanned the treetops. The strange hum had vanished, but that didn't mean they were safe. They were being watched. He could feel it. The silent pursuers. They moved through the forest quickly. Jack knew these woods like the back of his hand. He had spent years out here, living off the land. If anyone could hide from an alien threat, it was him. But something felt wrong. Lyrian walked beside him, her small steps careful and quiet. She was watching everything, her ears tuned to sounds that Jack couldn't even hear. And then she froze. Jack stopped immediately. "What is it?" Lyrian's breathing quickened. Her fingers dug into his sleeve as she pointed toward the trees. Jack narrowed his eyes, following her gaze. At first, he saw nothing. Just the thick forest, the tall trees swaying in the wind. But then, a shape moved. Not human. The figure stood in the distance, half hidden behind the trees. It was tall, its body covered in dark armor. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, watching them without blinking. Jack's stomach tightened. Jarek. It didn't move. It just stood there, studying them, hunting them. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but he didn't. Instead, he slowly reached for his rifle, keeping his movements controlled. If this thing was here, others were too. Lyrian's voice was barely a whisper. "More." Jack clenched his jaw. Of course. He scanned the tree line, and now he saw them. 3 more figures, their dark forms shifting between the trees like shadows. They were surrounded. Jack Carter's choice. Jack had been in bad situations before, but this was different. His mind raced. He could try to run, but Lyrian wouldn't make it far on foot. He could try to fight, but if these things were as deadly as she said, he'd be dead in seconds. Then, the first Jarek stepped forward. Its voice was a deep, guttural growl. "Give us the girl." Jack didn't understand the language, but he understood the meaning. His fingers tightened around his rifle. Not a chance. Lyrian's grip on his sleeve tightened. She was terrified. Jack exhaled. He didn't know why he cared so much about this kid. He could have walked away the moment he found her, could have ignored the strange pot in the woods. But he didn't, because Jack Carter didn't abandon people who needed him. His eyes locked onto the nearest Jarek. His mind was made up. He would fight, even if it was his last battle. The forest was deathly silent. The wind had stopped, and even the animals seemed to have vanished. Jack Carter stood firm, his rifle raised, his heartbeat steady despite the danger surrounding him. The Jarek warriors, tall, armored, and menacing, moved like shadows, their glowing green eyes locked onto their target. Lyrian. Jack knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them take her. Lyrian clutched his sleeve, her small hands trembling. "Jack," she whispered, fear thick in her voice. He didn't take his eyes off the enemy. "Listen to me, kid. When I say run, you run. Got it?" Lyrian hesitated, but then gave a small nod. The leader of the Jarek pack took another step forward. Its deep, guttural voice rumbled through the air. "Human, you cannot win. Hand over the child." Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. "Yeah. Well, I've never been good at following orders." The Jarek warrior lunged. Jack fired. The gunshot shattered the silence of the forest. The bullet slammed into the creature's armor, but instead of dropping, the Jarek barely stumbled. Not good. The second Jarek charged. Jack barely had time to react before a powerful clawed hand swiped at him. He ducked, but the force of the attack sent him stumbling backward. Lyrian let out a small cry, but Jack regained his footing. He needed a new plan, and fast. The Jarek were armored, too strong for normal bullets. But Jack wasn't just a soldier. He was a survivor. He scanned his surroundings, searching for an advantage. The trees, the terrain, the weapons he had. Use what you have, Carter. He spotted a dead tree branch, thick and heavy, lying nearby. In one swift motion, he grabbed it and swung with all his strength at the nearest Jarek's head. Crack cake. The impact was enough to make the alien warrior stagger. Not much, but enough for Jack to shove his rifle's barrel under its chin and pull the trigger. This time, the bullet hit a weak spot. The Jarek let out a horrible screech, stumbling back as dark blue blood sprayed onto the snow. 1 down, 3 to go. Run or fight. The other Jarek warriors snarled in fury, their glowing eyes narrowing. Jack grabbed Lyrian's hand and ran. The forest became a blur of trees and shadows. The cold air burned Jack's lungs, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Lyrian struggled to keep up, her legs much shorter than his, but she ran as fast as she could, her breath coming in short gasps. Behind them, the Jarek pursued, their movements unnaturally fast. Jack knew they wouldn't make it far like this. They needed a new plan. His mind raced. Think. The old cabin by the river. It wasn't far. If they could make it there, they might have a chance. But would they make it in time? A desperate stand. The cabin was just ahead, a small, abandoned hunting shack Jack had used years ago. He pushed forward, forcing his tired legs to keep going. Almost there. Then, a sudden flash of green light. Something whizzed past Jack's head, missing him by inches. It hit a tree, and the wood exploded into splinters. Plasma weapons. Damn it. Jack spun around, pushing Lyrian behind him. The Jarek were closing in. No more running. Time to fight. Jack raised his revolver, aiming carefully. The first shot hit a Jarek in the leg, making it stumble. The second missed, but the third, straight to the eye. The warrior collapsed. 2 down, 2 left. But Jack was out of bullets. One of the remaining Jarek lunged. Jack barely dodged in time. The alien's clawed hand ripped through his coat, tearing the fabric but missing his skin. Jack grabbed a hunting knife from his belt and slashed wildly. The blade cut through flesh, and the Jarek let out a snarl of pain. But Jack wasn't fast enough. The second warrior grabbed him, its claws digging into his shoulder. Jack gritted his teeth against the pain as he was lifted off the ground and thrown against a tree. His vision blurred. The world spun. He heard Lyrian scream. No. Jack forced himself to stand. His body ached. His shoulder burned, but he ignored it. Lyrian stood frozen, terror in her wide violet eyes, as the last Jarek reached for her. Jack wouldn't let that happen. Summoning the last of his strength, Jack grabbed a rock and hurled it with all his might at the Jarek's head. Bam! The warrior staggered, just long enough for Lyrian to react. Her pendant glowed suddenly, pulsing with a strange energy. And then, the air around her shifted. Jack barely had time to process what was happening before a pulse of energy blasted outward, hitting the Jarek directly. The warrior let out a horrible shriek before collapsing to the ground, unmoving. Silence followed. Jack stared. Lyrian stared. The last Jarek was gone. Lyrian's breathing was ragged. She looked at her pendant, her hands shaking. She hadn't meant to do that. Jack exhaled, wiping blood from his lip. He glanced at Lyrian, then at the bodies around them. They had survived. But something told Jack this wasn't over. Lyrian looked up at him, guilt in her eyes. I didn't know I could do that. Jack smirked tiredly. Kid, remind me never to make you mad. Lyrian let out a shaky laugh. Jack turned toward the cabin. They needed rest, but they also needed answers. Because if the Jarek had found them once, they would come again. And next time, Jack would be ready. The small cabin stood silent in the middle of the dark forest. The wooden walls creaked under the cold night air, and the only source of warmth was the flickering fire inside. Jack Carter sat near the flames, carefully wrapping his wounded shoulder with an old cloth. Lyrian sat across from him, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her violet eyes stared at the pendant in her hands, the same pendant that had somehow saved them from the last Jarek. Jack had seen a lot of strange things in his life, but what happened earlier, that was something else. Finally, he spoke. You want to tell me what that was? Lyrian hesitated. She had been silent for a long time, but she knew she couldn't hide the truth anymore. She took a deep breath. My people, we are not warriors. We do not fight. We are scholars, healers, explorers. She looked up at him. But we do have gifts. Jack leaned forward, listening carefully. That gift almost blasted that thing in half, kid. Lyrian flinched. I did not mean to. It just happened. Jack exhaled, rubbing his face. All right. Start from the beginning. Who exactly are you? Lyrian closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she looked at him. I am Lyrian Eshba of the Etheri people, and I am the last of my kind. Jack's expression hardened. Last. What happened? Lyrian's voice was quiet, but the pain in it was unmistakable. The Jarek happened. Jack had already guessed as much, but hearing it from her directly made his stomach tighten. They wiped out your entire species. Lyrian nodded, her fingers gripping her pendant. We had no weapons, no way to fight back. We were explorers, traveling the stars, searching for knowledge. But the Jarek, they see knowledge as weakness. Jack listened carefully, his fists clenching. He had fought in wars, seen ruthless enemies. But this was genocide. Why you? He asked. Why are they hunting you? Lyrian hesitated before whispering. Because I carry the last of my people's power. Jack's eyes flicked to the pendant. That thing. She nodded. It is not just a symbol. It holds the energy of my people. It is the last piece of us. Jack stared at the small silver object, a piece of an entire civilization, in the hands of a little girl. No wonder the Jurek wanted her. No wonder she was afraid. Jack sighed and leaned back. So what now? Lyrian looked at him, uncertain. I do not know. Jack chuckled dryly. Great. You've got an entire army of space monsters hunting you, and no plan. Lyrian's face fell, and Jack immediately regretted his words. He sighed again. Hey, we'll figure something out. Lyrian looked at him with hope in her eyes. You will help me. Jack smirked. Kid, I've already shot 3 of those bastards. I think I'm past the point of backing out. Lyrian's lips curved into a small, grateful smile. But deep down, Jack knew this fight was far from over. The Jarek's response. Far above the earth, beyond the clouds and the stars, a dark warship loomed. Inside, a towering Jarek commander stood before a massive holographic display, watching a live feed from the battlefield below. The warrior who had survived knelt before him, his head bowed in shame. Forgive me, Commander Vrakos. The human fought harder than expected. The girl, she awakened the power. Vrakos narrowed his glowing green eyes. The pendant had awakened. That complicated things. He turned to his second in command. How many troops do we have? The officer replied without hesitation. 2 battalions prepared for deployment. Vrakos considered this. Sending a full force for 1 human and 1 child was unnecessary, but they could not afford to lose the ethery power. His claws flexed as he made his decision. Send the Reapers. The officer's eyes widened slightly. The Reapers? But they have never been used on this world. The human dies. The girl is taken. No more mistakes. The officer bowed. Yes, Commander. Within minutes, the warship's lower hatches opened, and sleek, black hunter drones descended toward Earth. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun. Jack's warning. Jack was pouring himself a cup of coffee when he heard it. A low hum in the air. Faint, but unmistakable. His soldier instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside the cabin. The night sky was clear, the stars bright. Then he saw them. Tiny black shapes descending from the clouds. Fast. Unnatural. Deadly. Jack's stomach dropped. They found us. He turned and rushed back inside. Lyrian, get up. We're leaving. Now. Lyrian was already awake, sensing the danger before he even spoke. She looked at him, fear in her eyes. They are coming. Jack nodded, grabbing his backpack. And this time, they'd brought more than just foot soldiers. Lyrian's grip on her pendant tightened. What do we do? Jack took a deep breath. We stop running. Lyrian's eyes widened. But Jack gave her a determined look. We fight. Lyrian stared at him. Then, slowly, she nodded. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just running. She was standing her ground. Jack smirked. Let's give them a reason to be afraid. The night air was cold and still. The forest around them lay in silence, as if the world itself knew what was coming. Jack Carter stood at the entrance of the small cabin, his rifle in hand, his heartbeat steady despite the storm that was about to arrive. Beside him, Lyrian clutched her pendant, its faint glow reflecting in her violet eyes. Above them, in the dark sky, the enemy was coming. Jack could see the black shapes descending, sleek, metallic hunter drones known as Reapers. They moved like silent shadows, their glowing red sensors scanning the ground for their target. They weren't just here for Lyrian. They were here to kill him. Jack exhaled slowly. He had fought many battles, but this one was personal. Kid, he said, his voice calm. When I say run, you. No. Jack turned, surprised. Lyrian's hands tightened into fists. Her fear was still there, But something else burned in her eyes now. Determination. "I am done running," she said. "I will fight." Jack studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, kid. Let's give 'em hell." The attack begins. The first Reaper struck fast. A bright red laser sliced through the trees, setting the branches on fire. Jack dived aside, rolling into a crouch as the ground where he had been standing exploded. Lyrian raised her pendant, her hands trembling as she focused. The air around her shimmered, and suddenly, a pulse of energy blasted outward, slamming into the nearest Reaper. The machine spun out of control, crashing into the trees with a loud boom. Jack whistled. "Not bad, kid." More Reapers were coming. Jack took aim and fired, his bullets striking weak points in their armor. He knew he couldn't take them all down, but he didn't need to. He just needed to buy time. Lyrian focused harder, her pendant glowing brighter. The energy inside her built up, swirling like a storm. She could feel it, the power of her people, the strength of her ancestors, and she wasn't afraid anymore. She thrust her hands forward, and a massive wave of energy erupted from her pendant. The sky lit up as the blast struck the Reapers. The machines cracked, sparked, and fell, their systems failing under the force of the attack. For a moment, silence filled the air. Then, a deep, rumbling voice echoed through the trees. "Impressive." Jack turned sharply, his grip tightening on his rifle. From the darkness, a massive figure stepped forward, a Jarek commander, and Jack knew immediately this wasn't like the others. The final battle. The Jarek commander was taller than the rest, his armor thicker, his glowing green eyes locked onto Lyrian. "You have grown stronger, child," he said, "but you are still weak." Lyrian stepped forward, standing her ground. "I will not let you take me." The commander let out a low, rumbling laugh. "You do not have a choice." Jack didn't wait. He fired first. The bullet slammed into the commander's chest and bounced off. Jack cursed. "Of course you have better armor." The commander moved fast. Before Jack could react, a powerful clawed hand grabbed him by the throat and lifted him off the ground. "Your resistance is meaningless, human," the commander growled. "You should have left the girl to us." Jack gritted his teeth, struggling against the iron grip. His vision blurred, his lungs burning for air. Lyrian's heart pounded. She could feel the energy inside her growing, building like a fire that couldn't be contained. Jack had saved her. Now it was her turn. She raised her pendant high, its light shining like a star. The commander turned, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing, child?" Lyrian closed her eyes and let go. The energy exploded outward, a pure force of light and power. It rushed forward like a tidal wave, slamming into the Jarek commander with unstoppable force. Jack fell to the ground, gasping for breath. He looked up just in time to see the commander screaming, his armor cracking under the sheer force of the energy. Then, in a blinding flash, he was gone. The air fell silent. Jack coughed, pulling himself up. He looked at Lyrian, who was breathing hard, her body trembling from the effort. She had done it. She had won. A new beginning. The morning sun rose over the forest, its golden light shining down on the battlefield. The Jarek were gone. Jack and Lyrian stood side by side, looking at the horizon. Lyrian turned to Jack. "Is it over?" Jack exhaled, then grinned. "For now." Lyrian looked down at her pendant. "I was afraid of this power before, but now, I think I understand." Jack smirked. "You're a warrior, kid, whether you like it or not." Lyrian laughed softly. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. She wasn't alone anymore. And with Jack by her side, she knew she never would be again.